Well, hello there, and welcome to another edition of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Today, we are doing a bit of heavy metal. So with my genial assistant, Greg, this is another one I can actually pronounce. Cameraman Greg, I'm excited about this. I have my heavy metal hat on today because behind me is the heaviest of metal, the F-4 Phantom II, and we're going to talk about one of the iconic Cold War fighters. This airplane is still in service after 62 years, if you can believe that, with some air forces around the world. Right now, I am baking in this hat, so I'm going to remove it, and I'm going to toss it to my another perfect catch by my genial assistant, Greg, who is a cameraman who's doing a fantastic job. Now, I think we have vanquished Josh Gates with our gratuitous visual effects. So unless Greg is not going to add anything this week, I think we're going to do a straight up video, but you never know. I just threw the gauntlet down and I won't see it until it's through production. So I'm merely the talking head. Greg adds the magic. So behind me is one of the most iconic fighters, American fighters, that came out of the Cold War, the F-4 Phantom. The F-4 Phantom was developed in the late 50s, came into service in 1960, was constantly modified, and then actually retired out of drone service with the Navy in 2004, and then later with the Air Force. This particular airplane we'll talk about was over at Point Mugu. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the Phantom represents everything that was a culmination of thinking in design up to that time. And what do I mean by that? Well, you've got two J79 afterburning engines in this airplane. It had a top speed of just under 1,500 miles an hour, or a little bit over Mach 2. Greg, you can toss me a tissue. I did it again. Mach 2. Yeah, he's rolling his eyes. I'm sorry. Ba-boom, boom. I'm here all week. Be kind to your waitstaff. It was a culmination of speed and thinking about going faster and faster, and then also about weapon systems. And the idea was World War II, dogfights. Into Korea we had dogfights, but then we moved away from that. We moved to bigger airplanes with the Century Series fighters, and then with the Phantom a little bit later, thinking about we're going to go really fast and we're going to rely heavily on technology. Remember, doctrine at the time with the United States and the Warsaw Pact was Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union, were going to have a lot more airplanes. They produced a ton of the various MiGs that we covered in our last episode. And these guys that designed this airplane, McDonnell Douglas and the other designers at the time, always assumed that we were going to be outnumbered. And so the idea was that the aircraft could track multiple targets, and really the F-14 was kind of the culmination of that thinking, and we'll do F-14 at one point. But they added a second guy in the airplane, the weapons systems officer. He managed the missiles and the weapons on the airplane. The pilot flew the airplane, but everything was going to be done either over the horizon at great distance, and we were going to go really fast, and that was the key. So pilot and the weapons system officer is down in the airplane. The airplane has okay visibility, doesn't have great visibility. The rear guy, that weapons system officer, is really claustrophobic. He's buried down in there. You had, as I said, those big engines, so you get a lot of speed. And then what happened, Greg? What happened? Greg, what happened? I'll tell you what happened. Vietnam happened. And what we found out in Vietnam after a short period of time up against both anti-aircraft on the ground, anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, and with the enemy Air Force that would come in, fight, and break away. They wouldn't stay for a sustained fight because they were conserving their aircraft in the North Vietnamese Air Force. We found out that we were going to be doing the same thing that we've been doing in Korea and going all the way back to World War II, and that was, Greg, dogfighting, which means we get in close. And what happens when you dogfight? You don't have speed. You start to slow down because you're turning and you're trying to stay with the guy. And remember, these aircraft they didn't have the technology we have now. And you see some of these guys with either these big things on their helmets with like the F-35s, or some pilots have a reticle. You'll see a thing over their eye. They can actually look off and lock on a target, which is called off-bore sight targeting. They can actually do that now with some aircraft. You can't shoot a gun at them, but you could fire a missile at them that way. At this time, you still had to get behind the guy or far enough away from the airplane that you could lock him up. And remember, missiles only have a certain amount of turning arc because they're going really fast. They just can't, like in the cartoon, stop on a dime and go left or right. They have an arc. And so what you see, and you see a lot of this with when airplanes break, you'll see flares pop out the back, or in movies they'll say break, break. What they're trying to do is they're either trying to throw the gun track off of the airplane behind them, in other words, they have them in the guns, or they're trying to break a missile lock. And the idea behind that is you turn really tight and that missile can't stay with you and goes off to the side. The flares are for heat-seeking missiles, but some of these missiles are radar guided. They'll lock up on you with radar and they'll do it that way. But the idea is you turn tight enough to break the missile. Guess what? This airplane, when it went into Vietnam, didn't have one thing. Greg, can you see it? You can pan over there and look at it. I'll step out of the frame. What is it missing, Greg? It's missing something, and that is no gun. It has no gun. When it went into Vietnam, it had Sidewinder missiles on the rails, and it had Sparrow missiles underneath. And the Sparrows were radar guided, the Sidewinders were heat-seeking missiles, very early heat-seeking missiles, and that's all they went into combat with. Now, you can read stories about this where the weapons system officer, they would lock these guys up and they'd get a tone, because they get like a growl tone in their headset that the missile, okay, is telling the aircrew, okay, I see this guy, I have a lock, where the missile would come off the rail and just fall off, where the missile would, the MiG would turn out of the way and break the missile lock. That happened a lot, and they were in so close that they couldn't go to guns, and they didn't have any gun. So I'm gonna go over here and do what I do best. There's a nice plan view of this airplane, but you could see there are those Sparrow missiles hanging. We don't have them on this aircraft here, but they hang underneath, and then there's Sidewinders that could carry fuel stores as well. This aircraft was also used as a tactical fighter bomber. It could carry about 18,000 pounds of ordnance. But the big thing about the F-4 was it had a ton of power. This airplane was referred to as the Rhino. It was also referred to as enough thrust a brick would fly. It was called the Flying Anvil. It's a big, heavy airplane. And what we learned in Vietnam is we had a very, very high kill ratio in aerial victories in Korea. And when we ended up in Vietnam, guess what happened? That victory ratio, that kill ratio dropped down, and it was for two reasons. One, pilots had lost the ability to understand aircraft maneuvering in combat, and air combat maneuvering, as it's called, and one of the reasons was this airplane just wasn't that maneuverable. They also weren't teaching dogfighting as much. And the other problem was with the victory ratio that we talked about is the weapons that were on this airplane were early design missiles, and they were good, they would work, but there were many times when they had malfunctions. So there are a lot of MiG drivers on the North Vietnamese side that walked away to live another day because they had a weapons malfunction on the airplane. Now, you see the plan view, you see that dog tooth wing, and that is a very, very distinctive piece of this airplane. Why is that designed that way, Greg? Why? Greg is looking at me. That is designed, this wing is designed to generate lift with a high angle of attack, and that's why they developed the wing like that. Now, there's a young man who is at home that watches this show that also there are two things about this airplane. The airplane had a dihedral angle on the wing and an anhedral angle on the tail, and I want you to go and look that up. That's your work for this week while you're sitting at home, is figure those two things out. They were both designed, both of those concepts were designed to add stability to the aircraft. This airplane had an interesting characteristic, and we talk about some of those, in that it was subject to adverse yaw, and what that would mean is if you got the airplane into a tight turn, you would get a differential in lift on the wings, and the airplane would yaw back the other way. It had a tendency to pitch back the other way. They worked on that with the design of the wings over time, and this particular aircraft is actually an F-4S. Did you know that, Greg? An F-4S. This tail number, 851, was flying as a drone when it was retired with VX-30 in 2004 over at Magoo, but originally it was remanufactured from an F-4J to an F-4S. Now, Greg is looking at me like, what's an F-4S? Well, upgraded engines, upgraded avionics. It also had automatic leading edge slats. We talked about slats and being able to change the curvature of that wing on a high angle of attack or pitch. And this aircraft had automatic slats that were put in the F-4S. There was a bypass in the cockpit that you could bypass them as well, but they were automatic. So the aircraft would sense where it was and it would deploy those leading edge slats. Greg can get a pickup of that, but that's a dead giveaway on this type of airplane. And it, there were 265 of these made, Greg. Did you know that? That were remanufactured. Of the a little over about 5,000, about 5,100 were made. So this is an interesting, I use that term again, I always use it, an interesting airplane. As I said, they are still in production. I can say what I want about the F-4 Phantom, and there's a lot of Phantom fans out there. I'm actually a fan of the airplane as well. The Phantom is the first of what I call the Swiss Army knife airplanes. Greg, you're saying, what is a Swiss Army knife airplane? And that is the military, because of supply chain pressure and keeping these aircraft in the air and maintenance costs and everything else, was looking at aircraft to do a whole bunch of different roles. So this could function as a fighter bomber, it could do aerial recon. If there were recon versions of this bird, there were also, we've talked about Wild Weasel, SEAD suppression, suppressing enemy air defense. It did all of that. We've seen that come to complete fruition with the F-18, which now does a whole bunch of this ground attack fighter. It also now is doing the Growler role, the electronic warfare role. And the military is going to that more and more because of the expense of fielding these airplanes. So I'm going to put this down. I love the color scheme on this. The late 1960s, and this aircraft, which is in VF-161 colors, in the late 60s and the early 70s, they had really, really colorful paint schemes. You can come to the museum and learn about VF-161 and talk about that in a minute. Now, this bird, when it retired and it went to the boneyard, was with VF-MA 112, the Cowboys. The Cowboys flew this airplane. It was a Marine fighter squadron, and then it went over to be a drone, and it was retired, and fortunately, we were able to save it. When you come to the museum, one of the things you're going to learn about is some of the pilots. When we talk about the people and how important people are, every one of the airplanes at the museum has a personal story about pilots and aircrew and things like that. This aircraft is no exception. This aircraft is in the commanding officer's colors of VF-161, the MiG killers of Midway. We're going to talk about that. And his name was Wayne Deacon Cannell. Now, Wayne not only was the commanding officer when this squadron got a number of MiG kills right at the end of the war, but he also was a docent at our museum. And Fred Fun Fact, Greg, Fred Fun Fact, he was the principal of the Coachella Valley High School. He went on in and was involved in education. So there is a Fred Fun Fact for the day. And what we've got on the table here is we've got the aircraft, or the aircraft carrier CV-41 that they were actually flying off of. That is the Midway class carrier, commissioned in late 45. Another Fred Fun Fact, it is the only surviving Midway class carrier on display in the United States. There are some Essex class carriers. Greg, did you know that? There are Essex class carriers that are on display, but this was the lead of its class, and it was it had been redecked and modified quite a bit. It was retired in, I believe, 1992, and if you go down to San Diego, check it out. It's really cool. They got a lot of interesting airplanes on it and displays. The display that we have here at the museum, that is the configuration. It's got a lot of helicopters on it. Why is that, Greg? Another Fred fun fact, this is actually configured in the Operation Frequent Wind. My family says that about me quite often, frequent wind, but oh, Greg is laughing now. That's my comedy for the day. As I said, I'll be here all week. Frequent wind is when we were evacuating in 1975 the last of the folks from North Vietnam. So you see all these carriers sitting on the deck, or helicopters rather, sitting on the deck. Many of them were pushed over the side to make room as they flew out. The interesting thing is, what else is on that deck? F-4 Phantoms. So the Phantom had a very, very unique career. One thing you'll see on the side of the airplane is each one of the kills of this airplane. Now with the MiGs, we talked about last week the different wing design, and you can see, look at the wing shape difference. I was talking about dirty fingers last week, and when you could see MiGs pitch up when they were in combat, and you could see the wing profile, you could get an idea of what the what type of MiG you were up against. You can see the MiG victories. There are very few airplanes flying that are left in the active duty inventory that have the aerial victories on the side. I had the opportunity to meet Ron McGowan and Jack Ench, who were involved in one of those shoot downs of MiGs. And McGowan was an amazing guy. He has passed away. Jack Ench is still alive. He comes to the museum. If you ever get a chance, talk to him. But go to the exhibit at the museum, and you can actually learn about these guys. Their cruise plaque is actually here from 1972. So we have some interesting artifacts. And then we've honored them, and their aircraft are actually in their squadron colors, and you can learn about each of them. We also have a great painting by Stan Stokes, the world's greatest living aviation artist. Stan, I'll expect the check next week, of one of those F-4s coming aboard. Now, the F-4 continues to remain in service, and one of the most really interesting airplanes, or cool airplanes that are still flying, and Greg can get some pickup shots, is the Japanese have tremendous colors still on these airplanes. Turkey is still flying them, mostly in a ground attack role now. They're not being flown as air superiority fighters, but when they were, their biggest attribute was just raw power. What they taught F-4 drivers was, if you lost sight of the enemy, what did you do? You hit that afterburner and you escape, you pull away, you break away, and you come back around and try to fight another day. These aircraft could not and were not able to mix it up. It's an interesting design change in that the F-105, which we've done a story on, which is a comparable time rate fighter within about or fighter bomber within about 5 years, has a Gatling gun, and this doesn't. Now, they did, with some of the versions that did not have a gun, they could actually put a centerline 20mm pod on it, but it wasn't accurate. It was maybe good for ground attack and strafing. It was not good for air-to-air. You could not shoot anybody down with that. I don't know that they actually did. They might have shot some people down with that, but until they went after the F-4E and actually put a gun in the airplane, and then they could get up close and fight. But the one thing that we want to talk about is you can own your own F-4. Greg's excited. Are you excited? We have a bunch of these in the gift shop. He wants one. Greg wants one, as you could tell. So you can go out to the website. You can put all these together and make jet noises and move the airplanes around. Greg does that in the office quite often. I catch him, making jet noises and playing with these. There's a number of different types on the website, but this is the F-4 if you want to do that. So go out to the gift shop and get yourself. The kids love these things. So get this one for either your son or your grandson or your granddaughter or your daughter. Go out and pick one of these up. Now, the one thing I'm going to do today is I'm going to step over and go to my stage 2. And one could say, Greg, that this airplane had Moxie. I'm just like, I'm on fire today. I don't know what it is. This had Moxie. Now, Moxie is distinctively different. It was established in 1884, Greg. If this is from 1884, we're in real trouble. You have actually had a good track record the last two. I've had a poisoning incident, but this one you did not poison me, or the last two you haven't poisoned me. I hope that this was not on the shelf since 1884. That would be bad. That would be very bad. But to all the Phantom drivers out there, maintainers, armors, anybody that worked on the F-4 Phantom, we salute you, and you all have Moxie. Moxie is not a sponsor of today's program, although they're happy I've mentioned them 5 times, but let's try and see what Moxie tastes like. Greg, nailed it again. This one actually doesn't expire until October 16, 21. Wow. Considering when we're filming this, this stuff has a long shelf life. But Moxie is not bad. So I'll have another swig, Greg. Now, the interesting thing, what is the legacy of the F-4 Phantom? Not only is it just a great, all-around cool airplane, wonderful design, multifaceted, but it has a legacy, Greg. What is that? Do you know what that legacy is, Greg? It created the Fighter Mafia. The Fighter Mafia. Do you know what the Fighter Mafia is, Greg? The Fighter Mafia was started by a guy named Boyd, and you can look him up after this, but Boyd and the Fighter Mafia within the design team that for American aircraft coming after this, they made a decision and they pushed very hard that aircraft that were air superiority fighters had to be able to be maneuverable, to dogfight, and to be able to survive against that was still Soviet Warsaw Pact fighters. And what were those doctrines? Pilot goes up high with high visibility. The aircraft continue to maintain, if you look at the F-15, for example, the Eagle, you could see continue to maintain tremendous power and thrust to weight ratio in the airplane. They had to be maneuverable, they had to have a gun, and they had to be able to have radars that could track multiple targets. That really started with the F-14, but if you look at the F-14, the F-15, the F-16, and the F-18, they all kind of characterize that ability to be able to dogfight and mix it with the enemy. No longer were we going to rely just on speed and this lead sled to be able to fight. Fortunately, we're able to take the airplane strength and use it. That's why it's why it's still in operation today, 62 years later. But the aircraft, there is no question that the aircraft that followed it, those designs that came after it, were a definite improvement, and those were all things that we learned out of air combat in Vietnam, and they impact us today. Now, we are going through another complete change in that these aircraft at the time were not integrated very much as far as the battle space. And what I mean by that is if it was a Doppler radar or whatever these aircraft were fairly self-contained. They didn't feed data back. We've seen integrated avionics coming into the fleet over time, and with the upgrades on all these airplanes. The F-35 now is a step away. The F-35 still has good performance, and I know I don't want to get into a debate about the F-35, but the big change from the F-35 and all of those predecessor aircraft that I talked about is the integration of all of its avionics on the battle space. So all these airplanes are integrated. That kind of started with the F-14 with the Navy, because the Navy was concerned about Russian bombers and cruise missiles and over the horizon, being able to attack aircraft over the horizon. But it's culminated, and we continued to integrate with GPS and these different downsizing of avionics and all these things in these aircraft. We've gotten to the point now where we're dealing with an integrated battle space, and all of these systems can talk to each other. That didn't exist in Vietnam. These guys were out there primarily fighting for themselves. So remember, go out to the website and pick yourself up an F-4. You won't regret it. Greg is going to check one of these out immediately. So go out and pick one of those up. Remember to smash that subscribe button and like us on Facebook. We're trying to get on the YouTube channel, we're trying to get up above 1,000 subscribers. So talk to your friends and neighbors and get them to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have that. Remember, like us on Facebook. We can use your donations as well. I'm going to take one more sip of my Moxie. And, you know, I also want to pay homage to Spooky or Spooks, the Phantom little caricature. Greg can throw one of those up. Spooks is a great image with this, Spooky, and we love him very much. So thank you, all you Phantom drivers. One final Fred fun fact, as I'm throwing it in, Greg, I'm packing them in again today, is originally it wasn't going to be Phantom and their little Spooky, their little character. It was actually the name on this airplane enough was they were going to name it Satan. You can believe that. Satan? Greg?
Could it be Satan?
Thank you, all you Phantom drivers. My name is Fred Bell. I am done with Warbirds Wednesdays. Have a great week.